Okay, are we ready to go on? Yep. Okay, this is part 2. Not so much a matter of, finding Islam, for forcing it out of some of the texts, but rather on making room for Islam, on cultivating a hospitable imagination in a religiously plural world. In my first presentation, I offered the observation that Muslims have an easier time of making sense of Christianity than Christians do of making sense out of Islam. Let me add to that observation another one. Muslims seem to have an easier time finding a scriptural warrant for accepting religious diversity than Christians do. Anyone who has regularly attended interfaith events in the last few years will have heard a set of related Quranic verses, sometimes known as the ayat al-samuh, or the verses of tolerance. I could give several examples of these, but let me just give one. Perhaps the most quoted Quranic verse at interfaith assemblies is from Surah Al-Ma'idah, the 5th surah of the Quran, verse 48. In a context that explicitly speaks of Jews and Christians, the Quran says something like this: "Unto every one of you we appointed a different law and way of life. Then, if God had so willed, he could surely have made you all one single community. But, so that he may test you by what he has vouchsafed unto you, he has made you as you are. Vie then, compete with one another in doing good works. Unto God you shall return altogether, and he will inform you about the things on which you differed." For this remarkable passage, even religious diversity is seen as God-willed. If God had so willed, he surely could have made you all one single community, but God didn't do that. But now, each community has the task of working out the revelation it has received and the gifts it has received in faithfulness. If there is to be competition between communities, it should be a matter of vying in goodness. One scholar has called these Quranic words to compete in goodness, fastabiqul khairat, as a Quranic principle of interfaith relations. And the verse explicitly states that God is the judge, so that it is God and not any human authority who has the last word concerning our differences. It is not necessary in this world to resolve all our differences, and it is certainly not our place to pass ultimate judgments on one another. That can be left to God. That's a hospitable verse. It makes room for a wide human diversity. Now, perhaps I'm looking in the wrong places, but I can't think of a set of biblical verses that provide a biblical principle of interfaith relations in a way that is quite so straightforward. Certainly, there are teachings that are deeply relevant to the way we deal with people who are different from ourselves. The command to love one's neighbor, and indeed to love one's enemy. The golden rule. The 8th commandment is, I think, of critical importance to interfaith relations, and especially now to Christian-Muslim relations, after a season in this country of loud mendacity in speaking about Muslims and their intentions, as they, for example, attempt to build places of worship, or even to open an interfaith community center a couple of blocks away from the site of the World Trade Center in New York City. "Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor," ought to be part of the DNA of disciples of Jesus. And Luther's explanation in the Small Catechism makes it even more immediately relevant to our interfaith encounters. Remember this one? We should fear and love God, and so we should not tell lies about our neighbor, nor betray, slander, or defame him or her, but should apologize for, speak well of, and interpret charitably all that he or she does. We can find biblical texts that speak to human diversity, after having, in my first presentation, gone to the book of Revelation for visions of locusts, a seven-headed dragon, the beast whose number is 666, and Gog and Magog, it's perhaps refreshing to look at chapter 7, in which a great multitude is gathered in heaven around the throne of God, singing, blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be to our God forever and ever. Amen. The text stresses the point that the multitude, so great that no one can count it, is from, I quote, every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, end of quote. Here and throughout the scriptures, the vision of the climax of history, the consummation of all things, is a vision that incorporates difference. Every nation, all tribes and peoples and languages, from east and west, north and south. Now, this text doesn't explicitly help us with religious diversity. How precisely God is going to deal with that, we don't know. But none of us are yet what God will finally make of us. None of our traditions are yet what God will finally make of them. And so perhaps one might dare to hope that the multitude of every nation, all tribes and peoples and languages, will include peoples and communities who now are divided by religious difference. Perhaps Christian eschatological vision, nourished by texts such as this one in the Revelation, may help to create room in the Christian imagination for a positive engagement with the world's religious diversity. Some of the most powerful texts in the Bible for fashioning a Christian imagination that is able to make room for people of other faiths, Muslims in particular, are the stories that Christian believers regularly read and tell and ponder. Stories that regularly land us in unexpected territory, where strangers, people from outside the familiar community, come to take a leading role. Let me take a few minutes right now to survey just a few of these outsider stories, if I may call them that. I think they're critical to the shaping of a Christian imagination that attends to those outside the immediate community. And so let's start with the Good Samaritan. For many of us, perhaps the first outsider story to jump to mind is Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. Jesus tells a parable about a man who came to the aid of a traveler who had been robbed, beaten, and left half dead by thieves on the Jericho road. But it is the unexpected twist that the one who proved neighbor was a Samaritan that gives the story its punch, that caused its first hearers to sit up and take notice. A Good Samaritan? What a surprise. Now, we all know the roles that Samaritans play in the New Testament. They are foreigners. The Samaritans, we all know, were ethnically suspect. The Assyrian conquest of Samaria, more than 7 centuries earlier, had resulted in the transfer of populations and mixing of peoples in Samaria. They were religiously suspect. Most obviously, they refused to worship in Jerusalem. They were even politically suspect. In the not-so-distant past, Jews and Samaritans had found themselves on opposite sides in regional conflicts. The result of all this was suspicion, condescension, and outbreaks of hatred, and a desire to steer clear of these others and maintain the boundaries. As a narrator's gloss in John chapter 4 tells us, Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. And yet, in this story, it is precisely the outsider, the foreigner, the one regarded with suspicion, who brings help and blessing. It was the Samaritan who proved neighbor. And with that parable, Jesus leaves his disciples with a new question, not just who is my neighbor, but who are my Samaritans? That's a good question for American Christians today. Let's go on to another one, the Samaritan woman. Here's a story that many of us heard preached on a few weeks ago, Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. Once again, there is something deeply surprising about this, surprising about Jesus holding a conversation with this Samaritan woman who is never named in the passage. Her anonymity is rather distressing in view of the fact that she far outshines the Pharisee named Nicodemus, a leader of the Jews, who visited Jesus in the previous chapter of St. John's Gospel. Remember, Nicodemus came to Jesus privately, secretly, by night. But the Samaritan woman spoke frankly with Jesus in a public place in broad daylight. Nicodemus gets a grand total of 3 lines in John chapter 3. But in chapter 4, the Samaritan woman gets 7 lines, and they are substantial ones. I'm struck by the quality of the conversation. The woman knows her local traditions. In a sense, she speaks for Samaria. She holds her own in the conversation with Jesus. Again, in contrast to poor Nicodemus, whose 3rd and final line is not much more than a cry of incomprehension. How can these things be? She even draws Jesus into a bit of religious controversy. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, she says, but you say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem. And Jesus seems to come right back with, you worship what you do not know, we worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the conversation moves on from this we, you drawing of contrasts to speech about the desire of God. The Father seeks such as these to worship him, to worship in spirit and truth. Is it too much to suggest that here we might have a biblical model for dialogue? In any event, the story says something profound about the mission of Jesus. One might ask what Jesus was doing in Samaria in the first place. The text tells us he had to go through Samaria. Had to. It was necessary. Ede in Greek. This, it seems to me, is not geographical necessity, but rather the necessity of the divine economy. The way of Jesus, for St. John, led through the territory of the outsiders. Let's take one more New Testament outsider story before turning to a couple of Old Testament ones. And it's one that is familiar, but which I find simply stunning. All of our children know this story. It's the story of the coming of the Magi in Matthew chapter 2. Now, as familiar as the story is, perhaps we don't frequently enough pause to ask the question, who are these Magi who, according to St. Matthew, were the first to pay homage to the child Jesus? Christian tradition, of course, has made them into kings. We 3 kings of Orient are. And trying to make the familiar, or trying to make the unfamiliar as possible, the tradition has even given them names. Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. But if we take another look at the text, we see that it nowhere calls them kings. There are not 3 kings in this passage, but rather 2, Herod and the one born king of the Jews. The Magi are rather astrologers from the east, Persian priests perhaps. We 3 astrologers of Orient are, that doesn't scan very well, but it's biblically more accurate. But what a surprise this is. Foreign astrologers are about the last people one would expect to show up at the birthday party of Israel's Messiah. They're out of place, actors who have blundered into the wrong set. And yet, there they are. They come, they kneel down, they pay homage, they offer gifts, and they disappear from the pages of Scripture. An Old Testament passage that perhaps can be paired with the New Testament story of the Magi, those mysterious astrologers who come upon the scene unannounced and unexpected, is the story about Melchizedek, king of Salem in Genesis chapter 14. Abraham, or rather Abram still at this point in the narrative, had conducted a successful military campaign against, let me see if I can do this, King Amraphel of Shinar, King Arioch of Elasar, King Chedorlaomer of Elam, and King Tidal of Goyim, more or less, and brought back the goods and the captives that they had taken from Sodom and Gomorrah, including Abram's nephew Lot. Upon Abram's return, we read, King Melchizedek of Salem brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, El Elyon. He blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by El Elyon, maker of heaven and earth, and blessed be El Elyon, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram accepted the blessing, gave Melchizedek a tenth of everything, and refused to keep any of the spoils for himself, saying to the king of Sodom, and in doing so used a startling juxtaposition of divine names, I have sworn to the Lord, God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything that is yours, and so on. Once again, we have an exceedingly mysterious figure, a Canaanite priest king, who enters the narrative entirely unannounced. He blesses Abram in the name of El Elyon, God Most High, an unfamiliar name, but Melchizedek then it characterizes El Elyon as maker of heaven and earth. And Abram accepts the blessing. Not only that, he regards the name El Elyon as unproblematic and makes use of it himself as suitable to be in apposition with the name of the Lord. And Abram appears to have learned something from the encounter, that the victory was God's doing, not his own, with the consequence that he should not take any personal profit from the victory. Abram accepted blessing in an unfamiliar name of God. This strikes me as suggestive, at least for our present-day interfaith encounters. In countless Islamic texts, God is described as Allah, Ta'ala, may he be exalted, creator of the heavens and the earth, nearly a precise parallel to El Elyon, maker of heaven and the earth. Nearly all of the words in these two phrases are cognates. This should be enough to give those who respond to the question, do Christians and Muslims worship the same God, with no, some reason to pause. And perhaps then the resolve to read Miroslav Volf's recent book on the subject. He's just published a book on Allah. I recommend it, but I digress. Another story. Let's remain with the biblical Abraham narrative, which is exceedingly rich fare for Christians engaged in interreligious encounter. It was my former colleague, Professor Terry Fretheim at Lutheran Seminary, who first called my attention to the power of the story of Abraham and Sarah during their sojourn in Gerar, recorded in Genesis chapter 20. You may not have read it lately. Again, I think it's a story that doesn't show up in the lectionary very often. It does not shed a particularly favorable light on the patriarch. Remember, Abraham and Sarah were residing as aliens in Gerar, and in order to obtain good treatment, Abraham put it about that Sarah was his sister. And as Sarah was a beautiful woman, King Abimelech of Gerar was more than happy to take her into his household. Not for long, though, as God came to Abimelech in a dream and threatened him with death because he had taken a married woman. Now, this is a story that was a real embarrassment to many Christian interpreters. What is a Christian preacher to do with a patriarch who appears to be ready to trade his wife's sexual favors for good treatment? The great 3rd century theologian Origen of Alexandria declared bluntly that a Christian simply cannot accept the literal meaning of this passage. but he had a solution. The text is an allegory. It can be read symbolically. Sarah, said Origen, is a symbol of arete, virtue. Abraham, as a righteous man, was adorned with virtue. But, and here I quote Origen, Abraham does not now wish that virtue be called his wife, for as long as virtue is called his wife, she belongs to him and can be shared with no one. So let us no longer enclose virtue within our bosom as a wife, but as a sister. Let us unite her also with others who wish her. So Abraham, of course, would not want to try to keep Sarah equals virtue to himself, but would share her with others. But if we refuse to follow Origen in his interpretation and simply stick with the literal meaning of the story, we soon find King Abimelech speaking to Abraham in great fear. What have you done to us? You have done things to me that ought not to have been done. And he was right, of course. In this story, it's the foreign king of unknown religion who speaks a word of truth, of hard truth, to Father Abraham. And surely this is relevant to our interreligious encounters. We may hear things that we do not want to hear, but they may be true or at least lead us into greater truth. I regard the Islamic challenges to Christian doctrine in this way. Sometimes they are on target and expose our own faithlessness or slide into one historical heresy or another. And at other times, they push us deep into the resources of our own faith as we seek language adequate to make an accounting of the hope that is within us. In story after story, the scriptures throw their readers and hearers a curveball. We think we know what's coming, and we're left staring after the called third strike, looking rather foolish, but wondering at the mysterious ways of God, a God who is at work beyond the boundaries of our familiar world. The biblical world is full of surprises. It is a world in which the Samaritan proves neighbor, in which King Abimelech speaks a hard word of truth to Father Abraham, in which astrologers lead the creation and the worship of the Christ child. And as we allow ourselves to be shaped by that world, we too learn to pay attention, to look for the workings of God in unexpected places, and to listen for the word of God on unexpected lips. Let me point out that one theme that runs through stories like these is that of hospitality. Hospitality sought and hospitality offered. Jesus, thirsty from his travels, sought hospitality from the Samaritan woman. Abraham, perhaps forgetting God's promise that he could expect blessing from others. Remember Genesis 12:3. I will bless those who bless you, God said to Abraham. You can expect hospitality in places. Perhaps Abraham forgot that. He despairs of receiving hospitality from Abimelech and tries to make his own arrangements. The Samaritan put the injured man on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The Samaritans asked Jesus to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. Melchizedek came to Abram with bread and wine. Abimelech said to Abraham, my land is before you. Settle where it pleases you. We may conclude this romp through the Bible with another story from the Abraham narrative, one that has provided the Christian church with, literally, its icon of hospitality. The story in Genesis chapter 18 of the 3 mysterious visitors to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre. You remember the story and how Abraham ran to meet the mysterious strangers. "My Lord," he said, "if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." And the mysterious strangers accepted Abraham's hospitality. The text tells us, in a verse that caused later interpreters much consternation, that they ate. Later interpreters ask the question, how is this? Do angels eat food? The Quran, which tells this story no fewer than 3 times, makes it explicit that the visitors did not eat, which then caused Abraham alarm. Precisely because this detail has been and is so problematic, I think it says something about the reception of hospitality. As every missionary knows, it's important to eat the food. As my wife learned when she first came out to Cairo to marry me, you have to drink the tea, no matter how strong it is and how much sugar there's in it. But I digress again. The mysterious visitors, we all know, were bearers of good and surprising news to Abraham and Sarah, that they would have a child. The story of Abraham and Sarah and their mysterious visitors is alluded to in the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 13, verse 2, where we read, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." Showing hospitality to strangers and learning how to be a guest oneself is a critically important practice of the church, one among a number of Christian practices that direct away from the familiarity of the immediate community towards those who are different, towards those who are outside. In recent years, there has been a burst of writing about this Christian practice, due in part to the challenges of living in a religiously diverse world, and especially since September 11th, 2001, and in part because of our ongoing debates in this country and other countries about matters of immigration. We have been rediscovering the importance of the theme of hospitality in the Bible, in the writings of the church fathers, in the monastic traditions, and throughout the history of the church. In the Bible, one thinks immediately of the life and ministry of Jesus. According to the prologue of St. John's Gospel, the Word came into the world as a guest seeking hospitality. And it says, I quote, "To all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God." In all the Gospels, Jesus is constantly both receiving the hospitality of others, religious leaders sometimes, but also the tax collectors and sinners, and playing the role of host, whether at the feeding of the 5,000 or at the breaking of the bread with the disciples on the Emmaus Road. One thinks of St. Paul's admonition not only to practice, but to pursue hospitality in Romans 12:13. That entire chapter is very important. We could spend a lot of time here, but let's move to the church fathers. A text that I find helpful for grasping the importance of the practice of hospitality comes from St. Gregory of Nyssa's treatise on the creation of humanity. Why, asks St. Gregory, did God create the human being last after the fashioning of all the other creatures? He responds, bear in mind this is the old translation of the Nicene and post-Nicene Fathers. As a good host does not bring his guest to his house before the preparation of the feast, but when he has made all due preparation, and decked with their proper adornments his house, his couches, his table, then he brings his guest home when things suitable for his refreshment are in readiness. In the same manner, the rich and munificent entertainer of our nature. How's that for a name of God? When he had decked the habitation with beauties of every kind, and prepared this great and varied banquet, then introduced the human creature, assigning to him as his task not the acquiring of what was not there, but the enjoyment of things that were there. That is, God is hospitable. God makes room for his human creatures. God not only makes room, he decks the halls. The creation of humanity is a great act of hospitality in which God, who has no need for relations with human creatures, yet grants them magnificently prepared space and wills to be in relationship with them. But if this is so, then to be hospitable is our privilege. It is a participation in the hospitality of God, who will be our host in the heavenly banquet. In this light, perhaps, we can understand a passage from the theological orations of a friend of St. Gregory of Nyssa, this time St. Gregory of Nazianzus, in which the great 4th century church father is debating with his Arian opponents about what it means to be a theologian. St. Gregory bombards his opponents with questions that anyone who claims to be a theologian ought to be asking himself or herself. Do we commend hospitality? Do we admire brotherly love, wifely affection, virginity, feeding the poor, singing psalms, night-long vigils, penitence? Do we mortify the body with fasting? Do we through prayer take up our abode with God? And so on. What does it mean to be a theologian? Note that we do not find here intellectual gifts or academic qualifications at the head of the list. Nothing is said about having a diploma from an accredited seminary of the church. Rather, St. Gregory's list is headed by hospitality. For Gregory, to whom Eastern Orthodoxy gives the title the theologian, the practice of hospitality, along with the life of prayer and ascetic discipline, is central to what it means to be a theologian. Do we commend hospitality? Are we nurturing the practice of hospitality, learning what it means to pursue hospitality to strangers, as well as what it means to be a guest in the world, as the incarnate Word came into the world as guest? Such questions, I think, are of immediate relevance to our life today. They're of immediate relevance to Christians' interactions with Muslims. Since my family and I returned to the United States from Egypt some 13 years ago, we have watched Christian communities grapple with a number of issues of hospitality in their relationships with Muslims. They have received immigrants, opened up spaces for prayer, sometimes in their own sanctuaries. They have sought to make room at the table for Muslims in a variety of interfaith settings. The issues that have arisen have not always been easy. I remember one Lutheran congregation that agonized over whether they could allow Muslims belonging to a nearby Islamic community center to use their parking lot on Friday. By contrast, I know a Shiite Muslim center in Chicago that very cheerfully allows members of the Lutheran church next door to park in its lot on Sunday. In a great variety of ways, we have struggled to make room for one another. And at this point, I want to show a picture from Tahrir Square in Cairo, taken earlier this year. There, Christian and Muslim protesters made room for one another in very practical ways, including making human chains in order to mark off prayer space. In the picture that you see here, Christians have joined hands to create a space for Muslims to pray. I find it a compelling image. And we struggle to make room for one another, not only in physical, spatial kinds of ways, but also in our minds and spirits. Can we receive not only the stranger's person, but the stranger's ideas, beliefs, and ways of seeing the world? As Christians, can we learn, for example, to read the Quran attentively? They're finding new, intriguing, sometimes disturbing perhaps, but sometimes exalting language with which to speak about God and God's relationship to the world. Can we make space in our minds even for sharp Islamic criticisms of Christian belief and seek an engagement that is not evasive or merely polemical, in the hope that through intentional vulnerability in interfaith discussion, we may be led to a deeper knowledge of the truth? This, of course, in all of this, we are dependent on the Spirit, that Spirit who miraculously created comprehension on the day of Pentecost and who leads into all the truth. I'm sure that many of you here have had your own experiences of Christian-Muslim hospitality, or perhaps of its failure. I want to leave a little bit of time for discussion and sharing. Let me leave you today with one very practical question, to which I don't entirely know the answer. The 10th anniversary of September 11th, 2001 is coming up very soon, and there will be a variety of commemorations all around the country. My question is this: as Christians, how shall we mark this observance? There are some possibilities that, frankly, I find very worrisome. The anniversary could be marked, for example, as a reminder that we are engaged in a great clash of civilizations. Or it could be an opportunity for reinforcing an exclusive identity of some us over against some them. It could be a time, I'm worried about idolatry, it could be a time for invoking or propitiating some deity whose role is to guarantee American security and prosperity, and whose sacred precincts are defiled by the proximity of a mosque. Think of the Ground Zero, a mosque debate in New York City this last year. But it could be otherwise. It could be a time for mourning innocent victims, thousands on 9/11 itself, tens of thousands in the conflicts that followed in its wake, during which so many Christians and Muslims and others have suffered and died. It could be a time to bind people of various faiths together in the determination to love God and to love the neighbor. I would love to hear your wisdom on this very practical matter. What do you think would make for a good commemoration? Can it be done with attention to those outside the immediate community? Can it be done hospitably? So once again, I thank you for the great honor of giving these presentations. I thank you for your attention.
We do have just about 10 minutes for questions and conversation. Raise your hand, and if you're called on, don't forget to press the button and turn the red light on.
Related to that is what about the death of bin Laden? You know, is that something we celebrate, or is that something we acknowledge happened?
Yeah, what would you like to say?
For me, it's not something we celebrate. You know, it's something we acknowledge that has happened, but it also points out to me our sin and the fact that we were able not to negotiate or realize some other alternative to this whole matter.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if you saw that Bishop Hansen actually issued a letter on the death of bin Laden, which I thought got it just about right. Now, he pointed out, we do not celebrate the death of a human being. We may be, in some cases, we may be very relieved at it. But I think there's a difference between that relief and a kind of exultant celebration. Yes, sir.
Because I spent 28 years in the Army as a career, and
And in the first lecture, I was talking about Luther too. One of the contributions that Luther made in those years of 1528 and 1529 was the question of whether a Christian could serve as a soldier, and often offered a lot of wisdom along these sorts of lines. One of the contributions that Luther made here was a refusal of the idea of crusade. One does not go off to kill to the glory of God, but on the other hand to protect communities, to protect communities, and if that is organized, by the prince, by the proper authority, then it is okay. Then a Christian may serve. Yes, sir.
Could you say a little bit about Muslim and Christian fundamentalism and how that kind of comes into the mix in this dialogue? I mean, it seems to me that there's a moderate view, and then there is the more extremes that we deal with.
Yeah, and as you point out, it goes straight across. Christians. You've got a spectrum of Christians, and you've got a spectrum of Muslims. And so I think it's just really important, for the peace of the world. This is a world in which Christians and Muslims together, make up nearly 50% of the population. In the future, it'll be greater than 50%. So just the question of how Christians and Muslims get along is awfully, awfully important. So I think it makes it terrifically important for people we would call moderates, people who are able to pay attention to those outside the immediate community, to use the language I've been using in my presentation, to do that, to reach out, to make alliances. That's what's so exciting about this. And what some people have been calling the Arab Spring is that we've seen Christians and Muslims together. And now in Egypt, there are very, very vigorous political discussions about, what is the future going to be? And Christians and Muslims are participating in that. What can we be together? And I'd like to say, too, that this country, the United States of America, I think here is awfully, awfully important for the future of the world. Because this is a place where there are many Christians and there are many Muslims who are able to seek one another out, who are asking questions about what does it mean to be a faithful member of my own community, to be faithful to my own religion, and at the same time, to be part of this American community, to be engaged in democratic politics, etc., etc., etc. This is a project that I think Christians and Muslims can be in together. So those places where we can, seek one another out and work together, I think are awfully, awfully important. Another place, by the way, where I see that is in the North American Academy. I was sharing with someone earlier that I think one of the things that's very special about the United States of America is that we've got so many colleges, all up and down the country. It's very different than, say, Western Europe, where you have, the major universities. We've got lots and lots of colleges, and these days all of those colleges want Muslim professors, with the result that there is just a remarkable community of bright young Muslim scholars in this country, all of whom are asking these questions about what does it mean to, on the one hand, be faithfully Muslim, but on the other hand, to engage the modern world, to engage people of other faiths, to be part of a secular society, to be part of a democratic society. All of these questions about democratic politics and gender and so on. It's just remarkable. So this place is important. So hospitality right here in this country is important. It's important for the future of the world, folks. So. Yes, sir.
How is it we don't hear of any moderate Muslims who are willing to speak out against the atrocities that we commit?
I often hear that question, and it continues to confuse me, because I hear many moderate Muslims, who do that and do that all the time. In fact, moderate Muslims who, in a sense, complain because, how many times do you have to say it? Is it something that you have to say every time that you get up in the morning? That those people do not represent me. That the extremists, that is not me. I don't even think that's a betrayal of Islam. That is not the religion that my heart is devoted to. That is a terrible, terrible distortion. So no, maybe it's because I do live in a place where I'm regularly in contact with Muslims, and I'm in academic societies. And in a sense, I know which websites to go to. But I think there's got to be something here about the media, though. I think our media is much, much more interested in bomb throwers than it is in people who are interested in reaching out. Colin, someone who is, yes, sir. Please.
So what would be some of the resources that you would recommend as alternate, more moderate views on Islam? And you had mentioned a book earlier by Miroslav Wolf, I think.
Yeah.
I thought was good. What might be some good beginner resources?
Trying to think of what would be the quickest, most helpful way of going about it. One thing that you could do, well, let me recommend a couple of things. One thing that you could do is you could go to the website of our center. This is the Center for the CCME, the Center for Christian Muslim Engagement at LSTC. We have a web.
Louder, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I moved away from the microphone here. Our center, the Center for Christian Muslim Engagement, or CCME, at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, has a website, and there we have a resources page with links to all kinds of things. That's a good place to go. And I think it's interesting, too, to find a good bookstore and just go and browse. I mentioned this recent book by Professor Miroslav Wolf. His work has been in response to an extraordinary initiative of Muslim scholars in the world who some years ago put out a document called A Common Word Between Us and You. You can write that down, A Common Word. And there's a website. You just Google A Common Word and you'll get it. This was a proposal from 138 Muslim leaders around the world addressed to Christian leaders, including Bishop Mark Hansen in his capacity then as president of the Lutheran World Federation, saying, we think one of the things we can say in common is that we are called to love God and to love the neighbor. And it's fascinating. And that then has, there have been conferences that have come out of that, books that have come out of that, and responses by a variety of Christian organizations that have come out of that. That's a fascinating literature. I'd highly, highly recommend that. Okay. Yeah.
I just completed in our congregation a study of the ELCA document on Lutheran Muslim Christian relations, which is excellent too. That'd be another source. But I wanted to get back to
which one was that?
On the ELCA website, the Christian Muslim Jewish relationships.
Yes, there are a variety of things there. It's a document called Windows for Understanding.
That's the one I was talking about.
Let me recommend that.
That's the one
And on the same website, there is now a set of Christian Muslim talking points, yes. A set of 8 pamphlets about particular issues in Christian Muslim relations.
I also wanted to get back to the comment about the hearing from the moderates. Do we as Christians condemn the burning of the Qurans or the picketing of funerals? How strongly do we get out and speak against them, just as well as Muslims speaking against the radicals?
Well, that's something that we hear from Muslim leaders. When we get together with our Muslim friends, they say, where's the Christian voice? And in a sense, we end up saying the same thing. There are Christians who are saying that, but we just, on all sides, we don't hear what we feel we need to hear often enough. Yes, ma'am.
Thanks. Can you cite the text, if I wanted to look up the one that's in the Quran about the verses that are the wonderful hospitality of God didn't create you as a single?
Yes, it's Surah number 5.
How do you spell that? My ignorance.
Oh, well, chapter.
Surah?
The Quran is
okay.
divided into 114. The Arabic word is surahs, but
Okay.
we usually say chapters. So chapter 5,
Uh-huh.
verse 48.
Thank you.
And while you're at it, look up chapter 49, verse 13, which I was going to talk about, but I thought, no, we need some more time to talk at the end. So.
Thank you.
Speaking of the end.
That's what I was speaking of the end in the first lecture.
Um,
Oh, can I? Yes, please.
Yeah, first of all, I'm imam from the local mosque on Monticello Road, like that. And I was very, very happy to. Very happy to notice in the newspaper today that the Lutheran Seminary would be hosting this dialogue, this conference, this presentation. So I made it my business to leave work and come. And I have thoroughly enjoyed it. And I want to say that we are trying to be better in South Carolina. Usually when something happens, the newspaper will contact us, and we're usually in the newspaper, or we're usually in the news, but we don't get that privilege too often unless it bleeds. They don't want to let it lead. But I would like to say that we have a challenge, and I think we're overcoming it with maybe the second, third generation of Muslims that have come here. And then the Muslims who are indigenous like myself, who was once a member of what was called the Nation of Islam, and we have come out of that. I know Minister Farrakhan is still out there, but the majority of us came out of that and came into Orthodox Islam or Sunni Islam. And we're now trying to dialogue with the mosque that have leadership that has come from overseas. And what we're trying to explain to them is that the American people are very intelligent, very sensitive, but we need to approach the situation not from the standpoint of where they have come from with the antagonism and with the oppression that they have in many of their countries, but to come to America and not try to lead us in America, but assist us in trying to help promote dialogue, understanding, but also to help Muslims understand Islam and our religion. That's a big responsibility. Many Muslims, we're just not clear on what our religion really says, as I have found.
I think a lot of Christians could say the same thing.
But yes, I know that because I come from a Christian background. but we're trying to improve upon that. So pretty soon we'll say to you, visit the mosque. It's not too fancy, but it's where we are. And we have we try to get involved with what is called Partners in Dialogue. Dr. Carl Evans has a big group, now it's statewide. It used to be at the university, USC, but now it's in the community, and it's a statewide group of religious people from all backgrounds and all religious persuasions. And we're trying to promote interfaith dialogue across the state. But thank you very much. I've really benefited tremendously.
Thank you very much. And tell us the name of the mosques.
It's Masjid as-Salam, the Mosque of Peace.
Thank you.
Yes.
And that's just nearby here, right?
That's right down, yes.
Right down.
Past
Okay.
Oakley High School.
Okay.
It's not too fancy yet.
Yeah.
The website of your center?
It's if you Google CCME LSTC, you'll get it. Or go to the website of the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago and just go down to centers. Yes, please.
Would you comment on the media speaking so fully now of Christian-Muslim conflict in Egypt, Coptic Muslim conflict?
Yeah.
A little background.
Well, the situation in Egypt is really, really complicated right now, because from the demonstrations in Tahrir Square and from the kinds of political conversations that are going on right now, one sees a very, very high level of Christian-Muslim cooperation, and it's a very vigorous interaction, which is a glory to behold. At the same time, let's just say that there's been a little bit of a security vacuum in Egypt. And there are places in villages or in certain slums of Cairo where there's a long history of conflict, sometimes exacerbated by what you almost might call gangs. And this last weekend, there was a church burning in Baba, which is a very poor slum area of Cairo. This kind of thing goes on, and probably will go on. I mean, a lot of violence comes out of places, where there's not a whole lot of economic opportunity, where there's quite a lot of despair, and where people are finding meaning by basically beating up on people or performing deeds of violence or dreaming dreams about imposing their will on others.
I think we could go on. That's a good sign. First of all, thank you all for being here today. Please plan to join us next year for the 2012 Yost Lecture. And one more time, let's express our thanks to Dr. Swanson.